They say some places remember what the living try to forget. Welcome to FolkFear, where ancient rituals, buried grief, and forgotten curses bleed quietly into the present. In this world, horror doesn't scream, it whispers. It drips from clay jars left too long in silence. It ripples across sacred water drawn after sunset. It waits patiently in the dark corners of memory. Here, every tale is a pulse beneath still ground. Every voice echoes an old belief, and every story reminds you traditions are not just stories, they are warnings. Tonight's tale is not fiction, it is an echo. From a village veiled in mist, from water that remembers every sorrow ever spilled into its depths, this is the water that remembers. Come close and listen.
The village of Ban Kradum Thong was a place that did not welcome change. Cradled by the jungle and crowned with moss-covered rooftops, it remained still even when the world outside spun with urgency. The trees there grew thick and old, their roots tangling like the veins of the land itself. The sacred spring sat at the village's heart, clear, cold, and watched by eyes older than memory. No one drew from the spring after sunset. That was the first rule every child learned, spoken in the same tone used to warn about snakes and fire. The spring remembered things, the elders said. It held sorrow in its depths, and if touched too late, it would awaken. And when it awoke, it drank back. Chawi stood near its edge now, barefoot on damp stone, her black hair tied with twine. Her fingers were clenched around a clay jug, the last jug she would ever hold for her husband. The dawn was still a few breaths away, but the ritual could not wait. Time meant everything to the spring. Words spoken too late became invitations, and grief unoffered turned into something else. The jug was warm in her hands, though it had no reason to be. Its neck was narrow, the shape made for whispers, and inside, the hollowness waited to be filled. She was supposed to lean close, speak his name into it, seal it with the ashes of crushed bone and wax, then lower it into the spring, slow and reverent, until it sank and vanished. But her lips would not move. A group of elders stood a distance behind her, silent and watching. Their faces held no sympathy, only ritual. They had seen many jugs lowered. They had whispered many names. But this woman, she had not wept. Chawi had not spoken since the rope was cut from his neck, since they found him swinging from the bitterwood geam of their home, since his silence stained their house like mold. She had loved him once. Maybe she still did. But love had soured like milk in sun, curdled by secrets, absences, and the way he flinched when she asked about money, about late nights, about promises. He left behind no letter, only the sound of the stool knocked over. Now they wanted her to whisper his name like a prayer, to gift his memory to the water, to forgive him. But there was no forgiveness left in her. The jug trembled in her hands. "Say his name," Elder Noy whispered, his voice dry as old bark. "Let the water take his grief, or it will take yours." Chawi looked at him. Her eyes were flat. "No." The word cracked the air. Even the birds stopped. A gasp ran through the others as though a taboo had been touched. Elder Sap, who had once midwifed Chawi into the world, stepped forward with a gentle voice. "Child, if you keep what should be drowned, it will not sleep. The water must hush him." She didn't answer. Instead, Chowie knelt beside the spring, cupped her hand, and dipped her fingers into the cold surface. She expected pain. She expected to be dragged down, cursed or silenced. But the spring was calm, still, and somehow soothing, as if it welcomed her refusal. She stood again and turned away, clay jug still full and open in her hand. Behind her, the villagers began murmuring. The ritual had been broken. There would be consequences, that much was known. But Chowie walked away, and the spring, deep in its buried roots, began to remember. That night, she did not bury the jug. She placed it on her altar beside a dish of rice and a cup of wine. And when midnight passed, when the moon slid behind the clouds and the crickets went silent, she took her husband's ashes, opened the jug, and poured them into the spring. There was no chant, no apology, no reverence, only the faint sound of water swallowing what it was never meant to hold. And in that moment, just beneath the surface, something sighed. The sky that night had no stars. Above the village, the moonless dark pressed down like a forgotten lid, heavy and absolute. The kind of darkness that didn't just hide things, it listened. And in that silence, Chowie stood alone at the edge of the spring, holding the jug in both hands like a cradle. Inside, her husband's ashes trembled softly, whispering against the clay. The water reflected nothing. It was said that when the spring held no reflection, the veil between worlds was thinnest. That was why no one approached it after sunset. That was why every ritual demanded light, candles, torches, even the glow of dawn. But Chowie had waited for night on purpose. She wanted the spring to see him not as he was, but as he had left her, broken, faithless, and cold. No forgiveness, no name, just dust. She stepped forward. The stones were damp, but no mist clung to the air. It was strangely warm for nightfall. The crickets had long gone quiet, and the forest around her held its breath. Chowie tilted the jug. The ashes fell into the water like falling snow. There was no splash, no ripple, just a slow swirl of gray that vanished too quickly, swallowed whole. The spring took him without hesitation, as if it had been waiting. The surface shivered, then stilled. She didn't speak, didn't cry. She only turned and left, walking back to the house she no longer called home. But the spring wasn't done. Long after she had gone, a ripple stirred without wind. The water warmed, and from beneath its silent bed, steam began to rise, not like breath, but like something exhaling after a long sleep. At the same time, far away in her home, a sound echoed through the stillness. Drip. Then again. Drip. 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 But there was no rain, no faucet left running, no broken roof to explain the moisture that now appeared on her windowsill, or the droplets trailing from the mirror in her bedroom, or the single bead of water forming on her lip as she slept. By morning, the sun rose through a veil of thin mist curling from the spring. The villagers who passed it on their way to the rice paddies slowed their steps. They did not speak, but many turned their eyes away. Something had changed. At the shrine, the clay jugs, hundreds of them, sealed and silent, trembled faintly in their alcoves, just enough to make the dust fall. Back in Chowie's house, she awoke with a start. Her pillow was wet. She sat up and stared at the ceiling. No leak, no rain, but her mouth tasted like river silt. Her breath felt thick like it had traveled through mud. She wiped her lips and saw the smear of ash along her hand. She didn't scream, just stood and listened. The air inside her home was now damp. The wood felt swollen under her feet. The clay jug on the altar was empty, yet water pooled beneath it. She stared at it for a long time, then looked at her own hands. They were trembling, but not from fear. Grief, when denied the grace of ritual, curdled into something dense, heavier than mourning, more stubborn than rage. Something had come back with her husband's ashes, not him, but his silence, and now it was hers to carry. That afternoon, 3 children wandered too close to the spring. They said the water was warm to the touch, like a bowl left in the sun. One of them, a boy no older than 7, cupped his hands and brought it to his lips. An elder saw and cried out, but too late. The boy drank. And later, that evening, he told his mother that her brother didn't die in an accident, like she always said. He said the uncle had begged her not to drive that night. He said she ignored him. He said her silence killed him. The mother slapped the child in shock. But the boy just smiled and whispered a name that had never been spoken aloud. The spring had always been cold. Cold enough to numb the tongue. Cold enough to still bleeding fingers. It was said the chill came from its depthless belly. No one had ever reached the bottom, not even the monks who once tried to measure it with ropes and prayer stones. But 3 days after Chowie poured the ashes, the water warmed. Not sharply, not unnaturally, just enough to make people notice. The first to speak of it was old Auntie Rin, whose morning ritual included washing her face at dawn before lighting incense. She touched the spring and paused. The coolness that once shocked her skin now felt tepid, almost kind. She didn't mention it at first, but when the warmth lingered the next day, and the day after that, she began to pray louder. The elders gathered beneath the banyan tree, their wrinkled faces tight with worry. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the steam, a faint mist that hung low over the spring, even at midday. It curled around ankles like fingers. It fogged glass, and when the wind blew, the mist did not move. It clung. In the stillness, something else began to shift. At night, villagers heard whispers, soft, too soft to understand. Not voices exactly, but the shape of voices, as if someone were speaking from underwater. It came from the direction of the spring, but it didn't stay there. It drifted, carried through walls, beneath beds, through woven mats. Children began to talk in their sleep. One girl, just 5 years old, woke her father by calling out to him with the voice of his dead sister. She described the room where she died, the color of the cloth used to cover her body, the words she never got to say. The father wept, and then he sealed every mirror in the house with cloth. But it was not enough. The next morning, he found water on the windowsill. His daughter said it had dripped from the sky inside her room, but there was no hole in the ceiling, just silence and the soft, sour scent of wet ash. Meanwhile, Chowie remained in her home, unmoving, unbothered by the villagers' stares. She knew they blamed her, though no one said it out loud. Her doorway was marked with fresh palm branches, a quiet plea for protection. No one brought her offerings, no one visited, but the spring did. It came to her in droplets, from bowls she hadn't filled, from cracks she couldn't see, from her own mouth when she opened it to speak, only to cough up water thick with silt and something darker. She stopped eating, stopped talking, and in the silence she began to hear things. At first, it was the sound of rope tightening, then the creak of a wooden beam, and finally, his voice. Not her husband as he had been, but a version softened by despair. His voice called her from the basin, from the jug, from the water in her own body. "Let me in," it whispered. "You brought me back." Chowie covered every source of water in the house. She stopped bathing. She boiled every pot and discarded it into the earth. But still it came. From her mouth. When she opened it in sleep, it dripped out. When she swallowed, it filled her throat. When she screamed, the scream gurgled like something drowning. And still, she refused to speak his name. Outside, the spring no longer shimmered. It now glowed, faintly, faintly, beneath the mist, as though something under the surface pulsed with heat. Fish no longer swam near it. Frogs vanished, and the birds that once sang at its edge now flew wide circles to avoid the area. The shrine beside the spring grew warm to the touch. One night, Elder Sap entered to offer prayers. Inside, she found the wall where jugs were stacked, trembling, very slightly, but enough for the dust to fall like rain. She approached a single jug that had turned on its own. It faced outward, unlike the others. The wax on its mouth had melted, the string sealing it had snapped, and there, pressed to the inside of the jug, was a handprint. But no one had touched it. No one living. Elder Sap left the shrine in silence. She did not tell the others what she saw. Not yet. Not until she was sure. But that night, her dreams were filled with water. Black water, and voices whispering through the dark. "We are warm now. We can remember."
The clay jugs were never meant to be opened. Each one was shaped by hand, baked in fire, and sealed with silence. Inside, the name of the dead was whispered only once, spoken like a secret too dangerous for the wind to carry. Once sealed, the jugs were lowered into the spring, where the water would take their grief and hush it. But now, something had changed. In the shrine, the jugs no longer rested quietly. They quivered, they pulsed with warmth. Some oozed faint trails of moisture from the seams, like the names inside were trying to breathe again. One morning, a boy named Lek was playing near the shrine. He wasn't supposed to be there. His mother warned him never to go near the jugs, especially after the mist had started. But Lek was curious, and more than that, he had begun to hear things in his sleep. Voices, whispers that told him to find his real name. They said he wasn't Lek, that someone else had whispered something different the day he was born, that the jug with his true name was hidden somewhere among the others, waiting to be found. So Lek slipped into the shrine when no one was watching. The air inside was heavy, warm like breath. The jugs lined the walls like rows of closed mouths. He walked slowly, barefoot on smooth stone, drawn toward one jug near the bottom shelf. It was different. The wax was cracked, the string unraveling. He crouched, touched it, and the moment his fingers brushed the clay, the jug let out a sound, not loud, not sharp, but a wet murmur, like something whispering through soil. He pulled back, frightened, but before he could run, the jug shifted and rolled. It fell, shattered. The air went still. From within the broken shell, there was no name scroll, no ashes, no bone dust, only water, thick and dark, still glistening. And as it soaked into the floor, Lek heard a voice, not outside, but from inside his own head. It said, "I told her not to take the baby to the river. She didn't listen, so the river took them both." Lek screamed. By the time the elders found him, he was curled in a corner, shivering. He wouldn't speak, he wouldn't blink, but his lips kept moving, mouthing a name no one recognized. His mother, when she came, turned pale. That was the name of her grandmother, a woman who drowned in the spring while carrying a newborn. The elders sealed the shrine for the first time in living memory. But more jugs began to crack. Whispers now escaped through seams. Some said the jugs were no longer holding grief, they were releasing it. And grief remembered was far more dangerous than grief drowned. Elsewhere in the village, children began speaking truths they should never know. One child described his father's secret visits to a woman in the hills. Another named the herb her aunt used to end a pregnancy years ago. A third simply stood in the rain and repeated, "You left me in the well. You said you'd come back." Each voice that spoke carried the weight of memory, buried things, silenced things. The villagers began to panic. They consulted the monks who refused to return. They burned incense, read chants, but the spring remained warm, the mist refused to lift, the jugs whispered through stone. And Chawi? She sat in her house, alone. Water crawled along the ceiling. It pooled in her bowls. It wept from her walls. But the worst was not what she saw. It was what she heard. Every time she tried to sleep, a new voice arrived. Sometimes it was her husband, sometimes it was a stranger, a child, a woman, an old man sobbing. They all said the same thing in different ways. "You broke the silence. Now we must speak." One night she awoke choking, gasping for air as water spilled from her mouth like a fountain. No one was near. The windows were shut, but her bed was soaked. She fell to her knees, and for the first time, she whispered back, "What do you want from me?" The dripping stopped. A moment passed, and then from behind her, a voice replied, "We want what you stole, a name without silence." By the fifth day, the water forgot its place. It no longer waited in bowls or jars. It no longer trickled downward with gravity's mercy. Now it crept, it climbed, it rose. It began with the ceilings, small beads forming on dry wood, collecting like dew. Then it slithered along beams, downward to door frames, pooling upside down before dropping with unnatural rhythm. Drip, drip, up, and then down again. In Chuai's house, water began to behave like breath, present even when unseen, always moving, always exhaling sorrow into the air.
Mirrors fogged from the inside, walls wept softly at night, and from the center of her floor, a small dark puddle refused to dry, though no one had stepped in with wet feet. The villagers called it cursed. The elders said little, but the spring had changed, and now the rules bent. One morning, Chwai found the altar overturned. The clay jug, the one that once held her husband's ashes, was lying on its side, cracked. Water had seeped from it, though it had been empty for days. Not spilled water, not a leak, but fresh, warm, and still. She touched it and felt heat. A slow pulsing warmth like a heartbeat trapped beneath skin. Her fingers trembled. She recoiled, but too late. The warmth spread through her palm, climbed her wrist, and nestled into her bones like memory. That night, the dreams changed. She stood knee-deep in the spring, though it no longer felt like water. It was thicker now. Not liquid, but memory made liquid. Warm, dense, heavy with grief. And all around her, hands reached up from beneath the surface. Some small, some broken, some burned. Each held a jug. Each one opened slowly, as if offering her their silence back. She screamed in her dream, but the water rose to fill her mouth, silencing her like a mother's hand. She awoke gasping, her sheets soaked, her breath tasted of clay. Outside, the villagers had begun to mark their homes with salt. It was an old protection, one almost forgotten, but now revived in urgency. The mist no longer stayed near the spring. It slithered into windows, through door frames, even under fingernails. One woman found her infant's crib filled with water. No rain, no flood. The baby survived, but when she cried, the sound that came from her throat was not her own. It was deeper, older. It gurgled like drowning. The villagers turned to the elders, but the elders turned to silence. They too had begun to hear things, to see the drip trails rising across their walls, shaping words in a language they didn't speak, but understood. It said, "What you drown must stay drowned. You let one name float." And they knew. They knew it was Chwai, and they knew the silence had cracked. They gathered at her doorstep, not to pray, but to warn her. "You must leave," one elder said, his voice like stone. "You have woken the spring." Chwai said nothing. She looked at them through the mist curling around her door like smoke. She looked at their salt lines, their shaking hands, their fear, and she said only this: "I gave the water what it wanted," then closed the door. Inside, water rose again, not from the floor, but from the walls, the ceiling, even the corners of her eyes. It dripped upward from the altar, floating like breath, and in every droplet, every unnatural ripple, she saw reflections, not her own, but 100 faces, men, women, children, each mouth slightly open, each one whispering the same word: "Remember." They came at dusk, just as the last light drained from the rice fields. A procession of villagers, barefoot and wordless, moving as one body, like shadows unrolling across the damp earth. No torches, no drums, only the soft crunch of soil beneath their feet, and the distant whistle of wind curling through hollow bamboo. At their front stood Elder Noi, hunched but unbroken. To his right, Elder Sop, her hands wrapped in prayer cords. Behind them, young men held ropes, not lanterns. Chawi watched them from her doorway, arms folded across her chest. Her dress clung to her skin, still damp from the mist that now never left her home. Her eyes, once sharp with grief, now looked hollow, not afraid, not angry, just emptied out, like something vital had already been drained. "You've brought ropes," she said. No one answered. The silence felt thick, not just between words, but beneath them, like everything that could be said had already been drowned. Finally, Elder Noy stepped forward. His voice was not cruel, but tired. "You must leave, Chawi. The spring is no longer a spring. It has become a mouth. It is speaking." Chawi tilted her head. "And what does it say?" Elder Sop answered softly. "It says you did not let grief die. You fed it, and now it is feeding." Chawi laughed, dry, sharp, sudden. It startled the birds from the tree. She stepped past her salt line and walked toward them, barefoot, unblinking. The mist around her clung like a veil. Water dripped from her hair, though there had been no rain. She looked not like a widow, but a ghost of her former self. "My husband hanged himself without a word. You buried his shame. You whispered his name into clay and gave it to the water, like all your others, so it would never have to be remembered. You call it a sacred spring, but it's a pit, a hole where you stuff everything too painful to say aloud. You've taught the village to fear sorrow, to seal it in jugs and drown it in silence." She stepped closer. "Not me." Elder Noy's eyes were wet, not from grief, but from the heat rising off the ground, faint wisps of steam curling upward from the soil beneath Chawi's feet. "Then you have opened the mouth, and now it is eating." One of the young men stepped forward, rope in hand. He was trembling. "Bind her if she will not leave," Elder Noy commanded. "Take her beyond the ridge. Let the mountain hold what the spring no longer can." But before he could move, the rope in his hand slackened. Wet. He looked down. It was soaked, dripping, heavy with water. A moment later, he cried out. The rope twisted in his hand, slithering like a living thing, curling around his wrist and tightening until it burned. He fell to the ground as the rope writhed, slapping against the earth like a caught eel. Chawi did not flinch. She turned away and walked back into her home, where the walls had begun to bleed. Not blood, water, but red-tinted, like rust or memory. It streamed from cracks in the wood, pooled beneath her altar, and spiraled in patterns that resembled writing, but in no language she recognized. That night, the spring overflowed, not with flood or force, but with presence. Mist poured into every home. Bowls filled on their own. Cups tipped sideways and spilled without hands. Children began whispering again, except now they didn't whisper secrets. They whispered names. Names of the dead. Names never spoken. Names sealed in jugs now broken. And across every mirror in the village, droplets gathered into shape. One word, again and again. Refused. Elder Sop woke screaming, her hands soaked with water, though her door was locked. Elder Noy collapsed beside the shrine, clutching a jug that had split open in his arms, its contents empty, but echoing a scream that never left the clay. And Chawi? She sat in the center of her house,
knees folded beneath her, as water rose slowly from beneath the floorboards. Not drowning her, not yet, but surrounding her like an embrace. She looked into the pool forming around her and saw not her face, but his, her husband, eyes open, mouth moving, but this time not whispering. He was smiling. The shrine was no longer quiet. It breathed. At night, when the wind fell still and the village tried to sleep, a low rhythmic thrum pulsed from its stone walls, like a heartbeat buried deep within the earth. The clay jugs stacked inside trembled faintly, as though each one were exhaling grief long held in its hollow chest. The shrine keeper, old Janthun, had not slept in days. He sat cross-legged near the doorway, clutching his prayer beads, eyes fixed on the wall where the oldest vessels were stored, those with no names scratched into their bases, no records in the scrolls, only memory sealed in silence. He had never feared them before, but now they spoke, not in words, but in vibrations. Small hums that crawled up the bones of the floor, jugs that trembled when certain villagers passed, cracks that widened as the spring grew warmer. He knew one would break soon, he just didn't know which, until it did. At dawn, before the fog had lifted, a sound echoed from within the shrine, like stone splitting under pressure. Yantun rushed in, bare feet slipping on the wet tiles, and stopped. One jug had fallen. It lay in pieces at the foot of the sacred wall. A dark liquid spread around it, thicker than water, not blood, not ash, something older, something the earth itself might bleed if it remembered pain. But it wasn't the spill that made him cry out. It was what remained. Inside the broken jug, nestled in the clay dust, was a tongue. A human tongue. Still pink, still wet, still quivering. It twitched as if trying to speak. Yantun staggered back, hand clamped over his mouth. The beads slipped from his fingers, scattering across the floor like insects. He turned to run, only to see the other jugs beginning to drip. Not leak. Drip. From sealed mouths. Thin streams of water bled down their sides. Some jugs hissed faintly, others rattled like teeth. A few leaned toward the center of the shrine as if listening for something. And on the farthest wall, a jug twisted slowly in its niche, turning of its own will. It faced forward. Its wax was gone, its string uncoiled. Its surface burned with the faint imprint of a hand pressed from the inside. Elder Sop arrived just before noon. She found Jantun collapsed outside, his mouth full of water, not drowned, but silenced. When she stepped inside, her breath caught in her throat. The shrine was warm, not like summer, but like breath exhaled against skin, and the air smelled of wet clay and burnt offerings, faint but sharp enough to sting her eyes. Then she saw the broken jug and the tongue. She did not scream, she did not cry. She only knelt, placed her palm against the floor, and whispered a name no one else would dare speak. Pala. It was her daughter's name, the child she lost years ago, drowned in the spring during the season of floods. No body recovered, no jug made. They had called it an accident, but Elder Sop had always known better. Now, as her hand pressed against the damped stone, she felt a pulse, one that did not come from the earth, but from beneath it. And in her mind, she heard her daughter's voice, not as a scream, but as a song, a lullaby twisted by water and time. Tie the jug and seal the name. Drown the grief and hide the blame. But what you bury still remains, and water sings of all your shame. Her hand snapped back, her breath hitched. The tongue inside the broken jug twitched again and whispered, "Mother." That night, the village heard singing. Soft, high-pitched, childlike, carried through the mist. It came from the shrine, from the spring, from beneath floorboards, and one by one the jugs began to hum in harmony, not with each other, but with something deeper, something that had been silenced too long. The boy's name was Tom, 7 years old, small for his age, with eyes too quiet for someone who had only just learned how to read. He was the son of a fisherman and a weaver, ordinary parents with ordinary griefs, like cracked hands and late harvests. Tom had never been touched by tragedy, until now. He was the first to say it, the first to look up from his bowl of morning porridge and calmly tell his mother, "Uncle Fawn is going to die today. The rope will snap under the tamarind tree." Her mother froze. Her spoon slipped from her fingers, clattering against the wood. "What did you say?" Tom didn't answer. He blinked, slowly, then continued eating. Later that afternoon, the villagers found Fawn, the village carpenter, lying beneath the tamarind tree at the edge of the riverbank. He had climbed it to trim a high branch that hung too low over the footpath. The rope anchoring his ladder had snapped. He fell on his neck, just as the boy had said. Word spread like flame through dry reeds. How had the child known? His mother tried to explain it away. Bad dreams, coincidence, a child's imagination. But her voice shook when she spoke, and her hands trembled when she washed his clothes. Because that morning, before anyone had died, she'd seen the mist collect on the inside of their windows, and drawn across the glass in watery lines were the words, tamarind, rope, snap. After Fawn's funeral, villagers began whispering about the boy. Some said he was blessed, others cursed. But Tom didn't speak again, not until 3 days later when he walked to the old granary and sat on the steps, waiting. They asked him why. He said nothing, until sundown. Then he pointed to the storage room and said, "She's in there. She has the jug in her mouth." The elders opened the door. Inside, they found Grandmother Sigh, an old woman who hadn't spoken in years. She was crumpled on the floor, her throat swollen, her jaw dislocated. She was dead. And between her broken teeth was a small clay fragment, part of a jug's mouth, stained with wax, wedged so deep it had cracked her molars. She had swallowed silence. Elder Noy collapsed upon seeing it. He had made that jug long ago, one of the first ever buried in the spring. He remembered the name he had whispered into it, his brother's, the one he let drown without telling anyone. He had sealed that guilt in clay, hidden it in ritual, and lowered it into water with shaking hands. Now it had come back. Tom stared at the piece of jug in Sai's mouth and murmured something soft. No one heard him, but when they asked him to repeat it, he only smiled. The next morning, his mother found words scrawled across their floor, written in water. "He listens while you sleep." After that, Tom was not allowed near the spring. But it didn't matter, because now the water came to him, from under his bed, from inside the jar of rice, from the creases of his skin. He began to draw spirals, faces, symbols, strange patterns that resembled the markings on the oldest jugs. When they tried to burn his drawings, the fire hissed and died. When they tried to bathe him, the water boiled. And at night, his voice changed. It deepened, layered, like many voices speaking through one small throat. He would sit up in bed and murmur strings of names. Some were familiar, most were not. But one night, he paused between breaths and said, "Chawi's name has not been spoken. She gave grief a body. Now it walks." That same night, Chawi stood alone in her home. Water rose gently to her ankles, not threatening, not loud, just present. She didn't flinch. She no longer feared it. She whispered into the room, "Who else knows?" And from the bowl on her table, an answer rang, "The boy." But he remembers too much. Mirrors had always been treated carefully in Ben Gradam Thong. They were covered during funerals, wrapped in cloth during storms, and never left facing open doors. The elders said mirrors remembered things the body tried to forget, that grief had a way of settling in the glass, waiting for eyes to meet it. And now, every mirror in the village had begun to change. Not all at once, not violently, but slowly, unnervingly. It started with a droplet, just one, forming near the center of the glass, no matter the angle or placement. Even in the driest homes, where salt still lined every window frame, the mirrors wept. The droplets didn't fall. They clung, thick and unmoving, like the eye of something watching from behind. Then came the shapes. When people looked into their mirrors, they no longer saw themselves alone. They saw shadows standing behind them, faces over shoulders, movements that didn't match their own. At first they blamed fatigue, fever, fear, until someone saw blood. It was Auntie Fan who screamed first. Her face turned pale as she scrubbed the mirror near her kitchen and found streaks of red that wouldn't wipe away. Not paint, not rust, but blood, warm to the touch, and not her own. She had lived alone for years. Others began to report the same. One girl, brushing her hair, watched her reflection continue combing after she'd stopped. When she blinked, the figure in the mirror did not. It only smiled, wide, wet, and too full of teeth. A newlywed saw his dead brother standing beside him, whispering something in a language he did not speak, while his own reflection stared ahead, blank. And Chawi? She had already broken her mirror, long ago. But the water remembered, and now every surface in her home that held reflection, puddles, bowls, polished wood, showed something else. Not just her husband, not anymore. Now it was a girl, pale-skinned, long-haired, eyes like clay left too long in the sun, cracked and empty. She stared from the basin near Chawi's bed. She pressed her hand to the water's underside as if it were a sheet of glass. Her mouth moved, forming words without sound. Then, one night, Chawi saw it clearly. The girl was not a stranger. She was Chawi, but not the woman she was now. younger, hungrier, hollowed by something unspoken. She reached into the water, trembling, and the reflection reached back. But the water did not give way. It held firm, like a mirror's face, cold, watching. Then, a single word bubbled from the depths. "You liar." Chawi stumbled back. She hadn't spoken that word aloud, but she felt it deep in her chest, like something buried too long. A memory, not of death, but of choice. A night years ago. A broken promise. A secret she had never told her husband. And now, the water knew. Elsewhere in the village, more mirrors began to shatter. Not from hands, but from pressure, as if something on the inside had pressed too hard, too suddenly. Glass cracked with no wind, polished bowls split down the center. Water no longer showed faces, but shapes, flickers of movement, smiles that lasted too long. The elders ordered every reflective surface to be covered or thrown away. But the reflections didn't need glass anymore. They found puddles, wet tiles, eyes. A man died clutching his own throat after claiming he saw someone else staring back at him in the bathwater. A woman fled her home when her reflection refused to follow her movements and instead turned to face her directly. But it was the children who suffered most. They began drawing faces they couldn't name, all with eyes that bled. And when asked who the faces belonged to, they all answered the same: the ones who float, the ones who were never named. And in Chawi's home, as the last candle guttered and the windows filled with mist, the bowl on her table rippled. The girl's face surfaced again, only this time she spoke with sound. If grief is not drowned, it becomes reflection. Then the water turned red. The shrine no longer smelled of incense. It smelled of rot. Not the rot of flesh or fruit, but something deeper, older, like forgotten grief left to curdle. The clay jugs wept steadily now, streaking the walls with trails of red-tinted water that stained the stone and soaked the prayer mats. The shrine keeper no longer entered, nor did the elders. The doors had been sealed with rope and salt, but neither held. The jugs sang at night, low, rhythmic tones, like voices echoing through water. Each note throbbed with pain, memories rising and falling like tides. The sound was never loud, but it traveled far, threading into dreams, curling beneath floorboards, seeping into the bones of the villagers like humidity. And the spring itself? It pulsed. The surface of the water no longer lay still. It churned gently at all hours, as if something beneath it breathed slowly. The once clear pool now shimmered with colors no one could name, shadows of emotions turned liquid, anger, guilt, despair. Elder Noy stood at the edge of the spring one morning, staring into it, shoulders slumped beneath the weight of decades. "We made a mistake," he whispered. Beside him, Elder Seop nodded without looking up. Her eyes were swollen from weeping, not for anyone recent, but for those she had forgotten. For the daughter she buried without naming. For the child she never whispered into clay. We didn't cleanse sorrow, we buried it. We taught the village to choke on their grief and offer the silence instead. Noy's voice trembled, and now the silence is full. Seop looked toward Chawi's house, barely visible through the thickening fog. She didn't follow the ritual, she said, but maybe she did something none of us ever dared. What? She remembered him. The idea settled heavily between them. The truth they had spent lifetimes hiding, wrapped in rites, muted in sacred language, was now rising from the spring like steam. The villagers believed the ritual of the drowning silence was mercy, but it had always been suppression. Speak the name once, seal it, sink it. No mourning, no grieving, no questions, just disappearance. And now the spring was sick with all the sorrow it had swallowed. That evening, the rice paddies flooded without rain. The water came not from the sky, but from beneath. It surged upward from the soil, black and hot, choking roots, spoiling harvests. The air stank of mildew and clay. Frogs floated belly up on the surface. The villagers tried to drain the fields, but every ditch they dug filled again, this time with water that pulsed, warm to the touch. Chowie watched from her doorway. She knew now, knew what had grown in the spring over generations, knew that grief, when sealed too tightly, ferments into something alive. She had broken the ritual, not to curse the village, but to let it speak. Let the grief come up for air. But the village didn't want truth. It wanted order. It wanted rituals that kept wounds invisible. And now, those wounds were festering. That night, a child was born too early. The midwife screamed when the baby opened its mouth, not to cry, but to whisper, a name, one no one in the room recognized. And when they washed the infant, the water turned dark. The villagers gathered again beneath the banyan tree. Their faces were pale, their hands shaking. They begged the elders to restore the ritual, to stop the rot. Elder Noi shook his head. The water has heard too much. We can no longer silence it. Someone suggested exorcisms, another fire. Someone else finally said what they had all been thinking. Kill her, kill the widow, return the spring to quiet. Elder Seop rose slowly. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. You could kill her, you could burn her house, but the grief won't go with her. It's already inside you. It always was. No one replied. The crowd slowly dissolved into the mist, and the mist lingered longer that night, clinging to their faces, their dreams, their skin. That night, everyone smelled rot in their sleep, and in their dreams, each one saw a jug, cracked, leaking, whispering their own name. And in Chowie's home, water dripped steadily from the ceiling, onto the table, onto her lap, into the open jug she had once refused to seal. And as it filled, she heard him again. But this time, not as a ghost, but as something waking. The herons were the first to disappear. They had long been the watchers of the spring, tall, solemn birds with gray feathers and sharp eyes. For generations, they nested in the bamboo groves near the water, silent sentinels in the reeds. The villagers believed they were omens, messengers from the spirit world who came and went with the moods of the spring. And then, one morning, they were gone. Not flown away, gone. Their nests abandoned, feathers scattered, no prints on the riverbank, no flapping of wings in the air. Just absence, a space where something sacred had once stood. The silence they left behind was different. Not peace, but warning. Elder Noi stood beneath the bamboo canopy,
heart pounding. He had come to offer rice to the herons, a gesture of old, a tradition passed from one elder to the next. But the grove was empty. Even the air felt thinner, like breath withheld. He dropped to one knee and placed the offering gently in the mud. Then he heard it. A single shriek, sharp, sudden, unnatural. He turned toward the spring. The sound had not come from the grove. It had come from the sky. Above the shrine, a heron spiraled out of the clouds. But it was not flying. It was falling. Wings limp, neck twisted, body stiff as wood. It plummeted like a stone and struck the shrine roof with a sickening crack, bones splintering against clay tile. The sound echoed through the village like thunder. Villagers rushed to the shrine, gasping at what they saw. The heron's body lay broken at the entrance, its wings bent backward, beak shattered. But its eyes were open, wide, watching. Blood pooled beneath it. And in the blood, words began to form. Not written by hand, drawn by the flow itself. You kept us quiet. We keep you remembered. Chowie arrived last. She didn't approach the shrine. She only stared at the bird from a distance. The villagers parted around her like fog, some in awe, some in fear, none with kindness. One woman stepped forward, eyes wild with accusation. You called this. Chowie met her gaze. I only stopped lying. The woman spat at her feet. But before any more words could be flung, the blood at the heron's side shimmered, darkening, thickening, curling into spirals like the marks on the ancient jugs. Then it began to rise, not in streams, but in threads, long strands of red mist lifting from the ground, twisting upward like smoke. The villagers stepped back in horror. The strands coiled in the air, weaving into something, no, someone, a figure. Tall, faceless, its body made of drifting memory, and yet it pulsed with recognition. Everyone felt it. Grief, but not their own. It was the spring's grief, centuries of it, poured into clay, silenced by tradition, and now, for the first time, given a shape. The figure spoke with no mouth. You drowned our names, but names float, names rise. Then it vanished, scattering into mist, leaving only silence behind. And the heron? Its body had turned to clay, still in the shape of a bird, but dry, cracked, and hollow. The villagers fled. Some returned home and smashed every jug they had ever owned. Others scrubbed their walls, burned incense, offered prayers. But nothing stopped the dripping. Nothing silenced the whispering in bowls and basins and bathwater. That night, a child went missing. They found him sitting at the edge of the spring, smiling to nothing. When they asked what he saw, he pointed at the water and said, "She told me her name. She said no one else would." Elder Noy returned to the grove alone. He knelt where the herons once roosted and whispered to the empty trees, "I'm sorry. We should have listened." From high above, something moved, too fast to see, a shadow in the leaves. And from the mud at his feet, a single feather rose upward, clay-colored, warm to the touch. The cracking began at midnight. It was not thunder, not footsteps, but something smaller, sharper, like fingernails tapping from inside a shell. Tap, tap, crack,
The villagers heard it in their dreams first. A faint sound echoing through the bamboo rafters, hidden beneath the wind. Then it grew louder, from the shrine. The jugs were breaking. Not shattered in violence, but splitting clean down the center, like fruit too ripe with rot. Thin fractures laced their surfaces, weaving across once sacred clay. From those cracks, something wept. Not blood, not ash. Memory. It leaked as vapor, mist that smelled like burnt hair and river silt, mist that carried names. Chowie watched from her doorway, the fog curling around her ankles like affectionate cats. She didn't flinch, not anymore. She had learned its rhythm, its breathing, its grief. She knew what was coming. Inside the shrine, Elder Syap knelt beside the first broken jug. She dared not touch it. The name once sealed inside had belonged to a woman who died during childbirth 40 years ago. A woman silenced in scandal, whispered about in alleys. Her child had lived, but her name had been sealed away in clay before the crying even stopped. Now the jug had split wide open. Inside, no scroll, no ash, only a wet bundle of cloth. Still damp, still warm. It pulsed once, then collapsed into dust. Elder Syap wept. Not for the woman, not for the ritual, but for herself. She had helped perform that burial. She had whispered the name into the jug. She had tied the string with her own hands. I thought we were protecting the village. I thought we were keeping it clean. But the spring had never wanted cleanliness. It had wanted truth. And clay, no matter how thick, could only hold so much. Throughout the village, jugs began to crack in homes, too. Those kept hidden in back rooms, sealed with tradition and fear. Some burst outright, exploding into shards. Others merely dissolved, leaving behind water that pooled and whispered. One man opened his kitchen cabinet to find a jug weeping from within. He hadn't touched it in years. It had belonged to his father, sealed without tears, buried without ceremony. Now it whispered from inside, I begged you to hear me. When he touched it, the jug split. From the crack oozed a thick, dark liquid that smelled like guilt. By morning, the village was littered with broken clay. The earth had grown soft from the seepage, trails of old sorrow sinking into the soil like roots, and wherever the liquid pooled, flowers refused to bloom. Animals wouldn't step near it. Even flies avoided it. The spring had become a wound that refused to close. And in its center, Chowie stood alone. She entered the shrine at dawn. No one followed. Inside, the air was thick with steam and the sharp tang of dust. Dozens of jugs had split open, some completely, others just enough to leak what had never been meant to surface. Names hung in the air like breath. She knelt before a jug with no label, no mark, no wax, just a jagged crack down its spine. She reached out, and this time the clay did not resist. It crumbled beneath her touch, revealing a cavity filled not with ash, but with a tooth. A single human tooth, small, young. And behind it, a whisper. You lied to me. Chowie closed her eyes. The girl in the water, the voice in her sleep, the reflection that bled. It hadn't been her husband all along. It had been the child. the one she lost before she ever spoke of her, the one whose name she had never given, the one she let go quietly, out of shame, out of fear, out of ritual. The jug had never been made, until now, and the spring had remembered. She looked around at the ruin, clay crumbled, names exposed, grief uncontained. "This is what it looks like," she whispered, "when memory cracks open." Behind her, the walls of the shrine began to bleed, a deep, slow trickle, not water, not blood, but clay turned back to liquid, as if the shrine itself had grown tired of holding its silence. They spoke without tongues. They sang without breath. By the 13th night, the jugs were no longer just breaking, they were calling. Their mouths, once sealed with wax and twine, now opened wide, cracked and hollow, releasing sounds that should not have come from clay. Low murmurs rolled through the village like wind over broken stones, at first soft, then layered, then multiplied. 100 jugs, 100 voices, none alive, all speaking at once. The villagers began calling it the sermon. It always began after sundown, a slow moan rising from the shrine, from forgotten jars tucked into cupboards, from fragments buried beneath beds. Even shattered pieces still spoke, whispers rising from shards soaked with memory. At first, the sermon was only sound, but then the words became clear. "You left us, you sealed us, but grief is the mouth that never forgets." The villagers could no longer sleep. Some stuffed their ears with cloth. Others broke every remaining jug they owned. Some tried to flee, but found the paths out of Bon Kraduntong flooded, not with water, but with mist, thick and warm like breath trapped in a tomb. Chawi didn't hide. She listened. Every night, she sat cross-legged in her home, surrounded by bowls of water. Each surface shimmered with a different voice, a different name, a different memory. Some voices she recognized, some she didn't, all of them grieving. One bowl showed her mother, eyes swollen, singing lullabies to a child but never breathed. Another bowl showed a man she had once loved before her husband, his wrists bound in vines, crying beneath the banyan tree before he disappeared. And one bowl held her reflection, but the mouth in the water moved without hers. It spoke in her voice, but from another life, from the life of the girl she might have been. "You buried me before I became." The air inside her house felt thick with unspoken history. She breathed in shame, exhaled silence. She no longer flinched at the dripping from the ceiling. She had stopped mopping days ago. The water had risen to her knees. And yet, she stayed. Because what she heard in the sermon was not horror. It was truth. The broken jugs were not curses, they were confessions. And every confession echoed the same lesson. Silence does not erase, it ferments. In the center of the village, the shrine walls finally collapsed, not from fire, not from storm, but from pressure. The building groaned and buckled, bricks splitting, tiles falling like teeth. Clay spilled from within, thick and red, spreading across the earth like blood. In the wreckage, villagers saw hundreds of jugs now cracked wide open, each one echoing the same name in rotation, one after the other. Names of those who died in disgrace. names whispered only once, then drowned, names that now demanded to be remembered. And when the villagers drew close, they heard the last line of the sermon spoken in every voice, overlapping, echoing like waves crashing together. What you refuse to mourn, we will make you remember. Elder Sape collapsed at the edge of the wreckage, her hands covering her ears. But even inside her head, she heard it. Her daughter's voice, soft, accusing. You made them think I was an accident. You made them forget I had a name. She wept. For the first time, not in fear, but in surrender. One by one, the villagers followed. They came not to fight, not to silence. They came carrying clay, old pots, broken fragments, new jugs made that very morning. They brought them to the edge of the spring, and for the first time in generations, they whispered names not out of duty, but with shaking voices, swollen eyes, and breaking hearts. They wept into the jugs, not to seal grief away, but to give it form, to say, I remember. And the spring, now boiling gently, began to cool. Not completely, not yet, but the mist thinned, the water stilled, and for one silent moment, no voices rose, except one, from the basin in Chawi's lap. The little girl's reflection stared up at her, eyes no longer cracked, just tired. She opened her mouth and whispered, Now name me.
The rain stopped falling. Not just for a day, not for a week. The skies above Ban Kradum Thong sealed shut as if stitched by invisible thread. Clouds passed, but they never wept. Thunder grumbled in the distance, but never broke. The wind carried the scent of wet earth, but the fields remained dry. And yet, the village flooded. Water came from underneath. It bled from floorboards, pooled in shoes, swelled from the ground like blisters. The rice paddies drowned without a single drop of rain. The soil soured, roots blackened, seeds refused to sprout. But while the fields drowned, the wells dried up. Every pump, every jar, every hand-dug reservoir emptied. The water that once nourished now vanished, and what remained was water the villagers could not drink, because it spoke, and because it remembered. At the temple steps, the head monk packed his belongings without ceremony. He did not speak to the villagers, he did not chant. He simply looked toward the spring and whispered, It is no longer a source. It is a memory that has turned against forgetting. Then he walked barefoot down the mountain path and did not return. Inside the village, desperation began to bloom. Children cried of thirst while standing ankle-deep in flooded kitchens. Water dripped from walls, yet no one dared collect it. Those who did, who boiled it, filtered it, blessed it, found themselves haunted by voices in their dreams. One woman drank from a puddle left in her prayer bowl. She woke with a scream lodged in her throat and her mouth filled with someone else's breath. She said nothing for 3 days. Then she whispered the story of her miscarriage from 20 years ago in her husband's voice. The villagers began to understand. The spring was not punishing them, it was matching them. Every act of silence mirrored in water. Every buried sorrow returned with weight. Every forgotten name made heavier by thirst. And in this exchange, there was no balance, only remembrance.
Chawi stood in the center of it all, watching the world around her collapse, not with fire or storm, but with slow, relentless saturation. Her own home was now waist-deep in water. She moved through it like air. The surfaces of her bowls no longer rippled. They pulsed, as if breathing, as if listening. And still, the girl in the reflection waited. Each night, Chawi sat cross-legged in the dark, face hovering over the basin. And each night, the girl whispered the same plea. "Name me." But she couldn't. Not yet. Not until she was sure. Not until she found the piece of herself she had buried even deeper than the ashes. One morning, the villagers found Chawi in the center of the shrine ruins. She was holding a newborn jug, hand thrown, still wet, unsealed. No wax, no string. She was whispering into it. Not one name, but many. She whispered every child she had ever dreamed of, every life she had never spoken aloud, every ache she had silenced, every grief the spring had swallowed in her name. And the jug grew heavy. When she finished, she walked barefoot to the spring, her dress soaked, her eyes hollow and open. She did not lower the jug gently. She placed it on the water's surface and let go. It did not sink. It floated. And from its mouth, mist began to rise, cool, thin, and soft. A mist that smelled of rain, real rain. The storm opened that evening. A single drop fell into the dust, then another, then 1,000. And as the storm opened fully for the first time in weeks, villagers wept under the sky, hands outstretched, hair soaked, hearts open. The spring did not boil. It shimmered. And yet, the water in Chawi's home remained high, because some griefs, once unsealed, do not leave. They only settle.
After the rains returned, the village breathed again. Fields softened, buckets filled. Smoke rose from cooking fires for the first time in weeks. Laughter, thin and unsure, broke the silence in brief moments, like birds returning after a long storm. But the spring never laughed. It remained still, its surface glass-like, as if waiting, watching. And deep within that stillness, something stirred. That was when the child appeared. No one knew her name. No one had seen her arrive. She was first noticed near the ruined shrine, sitting quietly on a stone, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the water. Her dress was gray, soaked to the knees, clinging to her small frame. Her hair hung long and tangled, as though combed by riverweed. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She only watched. When asked where she lived, she tilted her head. When asked who her mother was, she pointed to the spring. Some thought she belonged to a visiting cousin. Others assumed she was born from silence. But it wasn't her stillness that unsettled the villagers. It was her shadow. She had none. Even at high noon, when the sun burned sharp and clean, she cast no shape on the ground. Where her form should have touched the dust, there was nothing. No outline, no echo, just bare earth, untouched, unclaimed. Children stopped playing when she came near. Dogs howled low in their throats. Mirrors refused to show her face. And yet, she was always present, by the shrine, at the spring, in puddles that never dried, watching. Elder Sepi was the first to approach her with courage.
She brought a bowl of rice and set it gently beside the child. "You don't have to speak, but you are not alone." The girl looked at the bowl, then at Sepi. Then she reached down into the earth, scooped a handful of mud, and pressed it to her chest. The old woman gasped. The mud began to pulse, softly, like a heartbeat. And in its slow rhythm, Sepi felt a name she had not spoken in 60 years, a child she had once carried, a daughter taken by fever, one she had never claimed, one she had never named. The girl said nothing. She didn't have to. The mud remembered. The next day, the girl wandered into Chowi's home without knocking. The water rose around her ankles, but she did not wade. She moved above it, untouched, her feet dry even as the room flooded. Chowi didn't turn. She was seated, as always, before the basin, face to face with the reflection of the girl that had haunted her for weeks. But now, the real one stood behind her. No shadow, no sound, only presence. Chowi closed her eyes. Her voice trembled. "Is it you?" The girl did not answer, but the water rippled. And from its surface a breathless voice rose, not a whisper, but something ancient and soft, like fabric pulled from a grave. "You gave me no name, but I found others. They remember." Chowi turned slowly, tears sliding down her face. "I was afraid of what they'd say, of who I was. I buried you in silence because I didn't know how to carry the truth." The girl walked forward and placed her hand in Chowi's. Her palm was dry, but Chowi's skin burned, not with pain, but with memory. Images rushed through her mind. A winter storm, a miscarriage she had hidden, the night she sat alone with the still body and didn't cry. Instead, she had washed the child, wrapped her, and placed her into the spring, without a name, without a goodbye. Only ritual, only forgetting. Now the girl had returned, not for revenge, but for remembrance. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You deserved to be held." She pulled the girl into her arms and wept. And for the first time, the girl cast a shadow. It spread across the floor like spilled ink, wide, solid, real. The next morning, the girl was gone. No footprints, no water, no bowl out of place. Only a shadow left behind, etched into the stone of Chowi's doorway, like a painting made from grief. The villagers began to understand. The shadowless child was not one soul, but many. She came to those who buried names in silence, and she stayed until they remembered. And when they did, she left them one thing: the weight of being seen. There were names that echoed after death. And then there were names that never died. In Ban Kradumthong, the villagers began to speak more freely, softly at first, at altars, at dinner tables, during night walks under a cooling sky. They whispered names of lost children, estranged siblings, forbidden lovers, names that had been buried too long under clay and shame. The air shifted. It no longer smelled like rot. It smelled like rain on dry stone. But one name refused to rest. It haunted the wind. It scratched behind walls. It curled beneath the villagers' pillows, waking them with dry mouths and tear-streaked cheeks. It was his name, the man who began it all, Chowi's husband, Corn. His name had never been spoken into a jug, never whispered to the spring, only poured into water with ash and anger in defiance of the drowning silence. His grief hadn't been drowned. It had been ignited. And now it lingered. Children spoke his name in sleep. Clay jugs hummed with the syllables. Reflections mouthed it behind glass. Chowi, once so certain of her vengeance, now feared only one thing: that in refusing to seal his name, she had given it permanence. That in rage, she had made his pain immortal. Corn had become the deathless name, the one the spring could not release. One evening, she stood at the edge of the water, the mist cool on her skin. I wanted to forget you, but you didn't let me. The spring didn't churn, didn't rise. It breathed. Steam curled across the surface in a spiral, forming the faint shape of a figure kneeling, head bowed, shoulders trembling. She knew that shape. Corn's grief had not ended in death. It had become structure, a framework inside the spring, holding up every other sorrow like a pillar beneath the weight of communal silence. He had not passed on. He had become the vessel. That night, the villagers gathered in the old meeting square, not for a ritual, not for a banishment, but for a naming. Together, led by Chowi and Elder Sep, they spoke his name aloud, Corn, not as a curse, not in anger, but in recognition. They spoke it as they lit candles. They spoke it as they placed jugs, now open and unsealed, beside the spring. They spoke it as thunder rolled low across the mountains. Chowi stood last. She held no clay this time, only her voice. Corn, she said, her voice shaking. I remember you, not just your death, but your shame, your silence, your sorrow. I remember the way you looked at me without answers. I remember how you folded into yourself. I remember your hands. She stepped into the spring, just ankle deep. I forgive what I can. I carry what I must. And I name what I once buried. The water shimmered. Then, for the first time in weeks, it rippled outward, not in defiance, not in warning, but in release. A jug on the far bank cracked open and crumbled. From within spilled not water, but dust, dry, weightless, ready to be carried by wind. The villagers stared. Corn's name had finally been received. The spring had taken it, not in rage, not in hunger, but in peace. That night, no voices whispered, no reflections moved on their own, no clay wept, only wind and silence. True silence, the kind that came not from fear, but from completion.
Peace is a fragile skin stretched over old bones. And in Bon Kradum Thong, that peace lasted only 3 nights. 3 nights without whispers.
3 nights without steam rising from floorboards. 3 nights when the spring remained still. But even stillness can be a lie. On the 4th morning, the mist returned, thicker, colder, edged with the scent of burnt clay. Birds flew low and silent. Dogs refused to leave their doorways. The sky hung heavy with clouds that didn't rain. And near the edge of the forest, something was unearthed. A boy named Wichai found it first. While digging for bamboo shoots with his grandmother, his spade struck something hollow beneath the earth, soft but rigid. He dug carefully, brushing aside mud until a shape emerged. Not a jug, a body, wrapped in oilcloth, bound with string, mouth filled with hardened wax, still whole, still sealed. The woman screamed. The elders came running, and Chawi, who had felt the mist returning in her bones, arrived without needing to be told. They gathered around the shallow grave, staring in horror. This was not the ritual. This was a secret, a second betrayal. Elder Noi fell to his knees, his hands shaking. His voice cracked when he spoke. There was another ritual, he confessed, before the drowning silence, when the spring was younger, when the grief couldn't be drowned, it was buried. Chawi stepped forward. Buried where? He pointed to the edge of the grove. Underfoot, always underfoot. He began to weep. We couldn't hold it all. The jugs filled, the spring swelled, so we began to bury the grief too dangerous to speak, the names too shameful, the deaths too strange. Chawi's voice was low. How many? He couldn't answer. Behind them, the mist thickened. Dozens of villagers joined, drawn by whispers only they could hear. Some came in silence. Others came with old maps, sketches, scraps of memory. And one by one, they began to dig. What they found would never be forgotten. Graves wrapped in woven cloth, jars filled with teeth, names carved into wood and crossed out with blood, bones twisted in prayer position. They had not buried grief. They had buried people. Unritualed, unnamed, their pain unspoken, their deaths unacknowledged. They were not just the forgotten. They were erased. And now they returned, not in body, but in weight. The ground trembled beneath the village, not in tremors, but in sorrow. Wells overflowed with salt water, windows cracked in perfect lines, and at the spring, the water turned black. Not poisoned, not cursed, but dense with memory. Elder Sa stood beside Chawi, her voice barely a breath. We betrayed them twice, first by silence, then by soil. Chawi's fists clenched at her sides. What do we do now? The answer came not from the elders, but from the spring. Its surface rippled, then parted, and from the water rose a figure, not clay, not corpse, but shadow. A woman, mouth sewn shut with thread, eyes wide and full of fire. In her hands she held a jug with no bottom, a vessel that could never hold. She pointed toward the graves, then toward the village, then finally toward Chawi. The meaning was clear. The betrayal must end where it began, not by sealing grief, but by speaking it. All of it. Names, sins, secrets. Spoken aloud, unhidden, unburied. And that night, the villagers gathered, not for ritual, not for redemption, but for a reckoning. They built no altar, they lit no incense. They stood barefoot in the mud beneath a starless sky and took turns saying the names they had once sealed in silence. Each name rose like smoke. Each name tasted like ash. But when spoken, each name lifted, not upward, but outward, from the body, from the tongue, from the blood. And at the edge of the crowd, Chawi stood still, waiting for the name that was hers to say. On the 18th night, the spring began to cry. Not in thunder, not in roar, but in a soft, steady weeping. A sound like a woman alone behind a wall. A sound like breath caught between apology and regret. It echoed through the village, low, wet, aching. No wind carried it. It simply moved, like fog through ribs, and no one slept, not even the trees. The branches bent inward. The leaves trembled, though the air was still. Dogs howled once, then fell silent. Lanterns flickered behind closed doors. Everyone knew the spring had begun to feel, and what it felt was grief. For centuries it had swallowed sorrow, held it, preserved it, never releasing it, never releasing them. Now it wept for all it had taken, and the land wept with it. Rain fell again, but it was warm and not from the sky. It rose from the soil, from the very ground beneath their feet. Fields turned to marsh, rice shoots floated like corpses. Footpaths disappeared beneath glistening pools. But this time, no one ran. The villagers did not scream. They did not call it curse or punishment. They called it mourning, and mourning deserved presence. So they came to the spring, not to pray, not to beg, but to witness, to stand beneath the crying sky and listen. Chawi was the first to step forward. The water had risen to her thighs, but it didn't resist her. She walked to the spring's edge, her eyes swollen from sleepless nights, her voice already breaking. "I remember your voice," she said softly, before it became a whisper. She looked into the spring. It did not reflect her. It reflected him. Corn, her husband, no longer angry, no longer faceless, just a man weeping quietly, surrounded by others. Children, women, elders, all the forgotten, all the unspoken, all crying with the spring. The villagers stood behind her, forming a ring around the water. One by one they stepped forward. One by one they spoke. Not rehearsed prayers, not borrowed words, but truths. I left her at the river. I was afraid of what they'd say. I burned his journal. I didn't want the village to know he loved a man. I buried my shame in clay and told them it was tradition. Each truth was an offering, each sorrow a brick removed from the wall between memory and mercy. And with every word, the spring cried louder, not in anger, but in relief. Because finally, it didn't have to hold it all alone. Finally, it wasn't the only one remembering. At dawn, the weeping stopped. Not abruptly, gently, like a breath finally exhaled after centuries of holding. The mist lifted, the water stilled, and for the first time in living memory, the spring reflected everything. Every face, every name, even the forgotten. especially the forgotten. Cha Wei looked into the surface and saw not herself, but the child. The shadowless girl, standing tall, whole, her mouth closed not from silence, but from peace. She did not speak, she simply nodded once and vanished into the reflection. No ripple, no sound, just release. Behind her, Cha Wei wept, not from guilt, not from fear, but from finally knowing that grief, when shared, becomes something else. Not a curse, not a wound, but a memory with room to breathe. Morning arrived like an apology. Soft light spilled across the village, not harsh, not golden, but pale and cool, like breath on glass. For the first time in memory, the mist did not rise, it simply faded. The birds returned. Not all, but some. A single heron landed near the spring, folding its wings slowly, its long neck bowing, not in search of fish, but in something like reverence. The villagers watched in quiet awe as it dipped its beak into the water and drank. The spring didn't react. It no longer churned. It no longer steamed. It had gone still. Not dead, rested. Wordless, the villagers began to disassemble the remains of the shrine, not with tools, but with hands. Brick by brick, tile by tile. They carried the broken pieces to the spring's edge, washed them in silence, and left them in circles like gravestones, each one marked by a name finally spoken. No one gave orders, no one wrote the ritual. It simply happened. Grief had become muscle memory. Cha Wei stood nearby, holding the last of the unsealed jugs in her arms. It was light, so light it felt hollow. She pressed her forehead to it gently, as if listening for breath inside. She didn't hear a voice. She heard nothing. And for the first time, that silence did not terrify her. It comforted her. It was not the silence of suppression. It was not the silence of shame. It was the final silence. The kind that comes when there is nothing left to bury. The kind that arrives when all names have been returned to the world. The kind that feels like sleep after a long, painful confession. She placed the jug gently into the spring. It sank. No hiss, no ripple, only a single bubble rising, then vanishing. Behind her, the villagers exhaled. It felt like all of them had been holding their breath for generations. Elder Sayep stepped forward. Her hands were wet with morning dew, not with grief. "Let this be the last name we give to the water," she said. No one answered. No one needed to. The wind moved through the trees. The fields glistened with new green. Children laughed without echo. And the homes that had once bled water were now dry, not cracked, not broken, just dry. Cha Wei returned to her home. She opened the windows wide. For the first time, there was no dripping, no whispering. She took the old basin from her altar and poured it out onto the earth. The water sank into the soil without resistance. No faces surfaced, no names rose. Just soil drinking grief and letting go. That night, the village held no ceremony. They simply slept. And in their dreams, there was only quiet. Not darkness, not fear, just quiet. The kind that follows a story told completely, without interruption, without denial. The kind that means, this chapter is over. The spring did not glow. The jugs no longer hummed. And across Ban Krarum Tong, nothing watched from mirrors, because nothing needed to. The water had remembered, the people had listened, and now silence was no longer a prison. It was a gift. In the heart of Bankradam Thong, the spring remained. It did not shimmer, it did not boil. It simply was, a mouth that no longer needed to open because all the names had finally been said. The villagers called it sacred again, not because it held power, but because it held memory. Children played near its edge without fear, their laughter rippling across the surface without echo. Women washed clothes there once more, singing songs that didn't tremble with hidden grief. Men fetched water in open jars, unafraid of reflections. The spring was no longer a secret. It was a mirror of everything the village had once silenced and everything they had now chosen to carry. On the 7th morning after the final jug was lowered, Chawi returned to the water one last time. She came alone, barefoot, without offering or incense. She brought no clay, no names, only herself. The air was cool, the light pale. Mist hovered low but no longer clung to her skin. The path to the spring was lined with flowers, not placed by hand, but grown there, wild and soft, as if the earth had bloomed from sorrow. Chawi knelt. The water looked back at her. She expected her face, but instead she saw all of them. Her husband, her unborn child, the girl with no shadow, the villagers who had once turned from her, the elders who had hidden too long, the forgotten, all there, all still, all watching, not from anger, but with something gentler, recognition. And then something changed. The water moved, not with ripple, but with form. It began to rise, not violently, gracefully, as if lifted by a breath from below. It shaped itself into a single column, clear, tall, elegant, and at its peak, it bloomed into something like a mouth, not of lips, not of flesh, but of light. And from it, a sound emerged, not words, but resonance, a vibration that echoed in her chest, in her blood, in the softest place inside her. It was not a question, it was not a demand, it was an answer. To every sorrow she had buried, to every name she had once denied, to every silence she had broken. Chawi closed her eyes. The light touched her brow like a blessing, and in that moment she understood. The spring had never wanted sacrifice. It had never demanded ritual. It had only ever asked for one thing: to be remembered, truthfully, wholly, with no part left in shadow. As she opened her eyes, the water settled. The mouth faded, but its gift remained. Inside her, something had been restored, not taken, not consumed, returned. She stood, knees aching, heart quiet, and she whispered to the surface, not a name, but a promise: I will not forget. She turned and walked back to the village. Behind her, the spring remained still, not silent, not watching, just still. And beneath that stillness, deep in the soil, deep in the roots, deep in the memory of the land itself, the water remembered, always, because grief that is not silenced must be remembered forever.